Good to see you this morning, whether you're here on site or you're with us online. We're glad that you've joined us. For much of the last year, we have been looking particularly at portions of the Gospel of Mark. During the summer, we've been looking at some of the parables in Mark, and we're coming to the last of them today. I'm going to invite you to open your Bibles, if you have them, to Mark chapter 13. We're going to look at just a few verses kind of late in that chapter. Before we get there, I mentioned this before, but I'll say it again, that I many times marvel at the fact that God has placed me where He has, when He has. And I am so thankful. Some of you know I love history. I'm fascinated by other periods in history for a number of reasons. But I have to say that even as wonky as our current point in time is, oftentimes or seems, I'm glad that I live today and not 100 years ago or 200 years ago. You also know I love to travel, and as much as I like to see other parts of the world and appreciate other parts of the world, I'm glad that I was born and that I live in the United States. And knowing as you do that so many folks grow up or live in homes or families that are anything but stable or safe or nurturing, I'm thankful for the family I'm part of and the home that I was born into. Having said that, there were times when I was growing up that things could get a little bit interesting at home. One of those times pretty consistently was when my folks were getting ready to go someplace. They were going to go out for the evening. Maybe they were going to meet up with friends, or they were going to go to some event. There was a kind of a pattern that you could pretty much count on every time. Let's assume that my folks are supposed to be someplace at, say, 7 o'clock. Well, by about 5, and let's assume that it was going to take them maybe a half hour to get wherever it is that they were going, which means that they should leave, somewhere around 6:30, maybe a few minutes before, just to be safe. Well, by about 5 o'clock, my dad would have shaved, showered, got dressed. He was ready to go. By about 5:30, he'd start saying to my mom, "Are you getting ready? Are you going to be ready? It's about time to leave." Now remember, it's still an hour before they before they actually have to be out the door. And my mom was very responsible. I don't ever remember her being late or tardy or anything. It's not like, you were always kind of having to drag her to things. But, about an hour before it was time to go, my dad would he'd start getting after my mom, which, you can understand. She didn't necessarily always appreciate. By about 5:30, or by about 6 o'clock, of course, he'd be kind of ramping it up. To my knowledge, they were never late to anything, or if they were, it probably was very, very, very rare. Now, I don't think I'm as bad as my dad, but, I certainly do have my moments. The reason is that waiting can be hard. Waiting can be hard. And it can be especially hard if it's something we've been looking forward to. We've been really waiting for the opportunity to go there or do it. It can be hard if it's something that's particularly important, particularly significant, and we want to make sure that we make a good impression. We don't show up late. We don't blow it somehow. As we finish this series on parables, as we look at this last parable, and as we prepare to launch into the series that will begin next week, which really deals with the last things, chapter 13 for the most part, waiting is a big part of it. It's a big part of it. And the last parable that we will look at is the parable of the fig tree. And waiting, in a sense, lies beneath the surface of it. So if you have your Bibles open, I'm going to read from Mark 13, starting at verse 28. Jesus says this, "Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that it is near, right at the door. I tell you the truth. This generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. This parable is, as you probably know, is part of what we often call the Olivet Discourse. It's kind of the last major group of Jesus' teachings before his crucifixion, his arrest and crucifixion. And it's mostly or primarily a look into the future. And before we get into what Jesus says specifically, let me just observe that looking into the future can actually do several things, or it can move us in several ways. Now, let's be honest. There's some folks that they don't really think about what's ahead all that much. And sometimes it's because they assume that tomorrow will be pretty much the same as yesterday, and next year will be pretty much the same as the year before. And, things will just keep going on the way they always have. There are other folks, though, who I suspect don't really worry that much or don't think about that much about the future because, to be quite honest, they have all they can do to manage the moment. If you're like me, you've had those days, sometimes periods of life, where you just hope that you're going to get through the day for one reason or another. And what's going to happen tomorrow or next week or next year, you just don't even have time to think about it. But then there are folks who think a lot about the future. And there are folks, as they look ahead, there's something there that gives them fear or anxiety. It might be losing a job and then the uncertainty of how am I going to pay my bills? Or where am I going to get my next job? For others, it might be a medical diagnosis that's rather ominous. Or it might be something as they look around at what's happening around them, something that they sense as being dangerous. There can be any number of reasons why people could be anxious or afraid, at times maybe even terrified. But then at the other end of the spectrum here, there are the folks who pretty much seem oblivious to kind of anything. No matter what's happening, they basically look ahead and they see nothing but sunshine and roses. The world could be collapsing around them, and they don't even know it. They believe in the inevitability of progress. And no matter what happens, it's going to be fine. And then there are folks who look into the future and try to outguess it. And sometimes that's really kind of what you have to do. There are certain people whose jobs is to try to look into the future and in a sense outguess it. Think about asset managers, people who are managing investments for others. They have to be able to look into the future and say, okay, well, what are the trends? What do I need to pay attention to? What investments do I need to stay away from? What do I need to pursue? Or people in other professions like, say, public health workers whose job is to try to anticipate, what diseases, what viruses might be coming our way that we need to be ready to handle. There are people whose job or just their wiring is to try to stay ahead of the curve, whatever the curve is. Now, starting in earnest next week, we're going to look more deeply into some of the things in the future as Jesus outlines them in chapter 3. And I suspect that one way or another we're going to see all of these different kinds of things in play. Now, as we get ready to do that, though, this parable, and we're not going to go deep dive on the parable, but as we do, I think this parable can help us set some basic expectations. Now, as Mark puts it in chapter 13, it functions something really more like kind of a summary, a wrap-up of what Jesus has already said. I'm going to treat it today for us as kind of an introduction, but I think it'll help lay the groundwork for what will come ahead. So, as we look into the future, throughout the fall, there are several things that we must do, or are looking into the future through the fall must do several things, or be several things. Jesus' purpose isn't just to prepare us, or isn't just to inform us, it's to prepare us. It's to help us be ready. It's to help us, if you will, be ahead of the curve. And so we need to keep that in mind. And that means that as we look into the future through the fall, our look has to be shaped by reality. Has to be shaped by reality. There are 2 times in the passage here that Jesus refers to these things. Now, there's always a scholarly debate about things like these things, phrases like that. Not necessarily universal agreement, but let me tell you what I think these things point to. Among other things, as we look through the whole of chapter 13, among other things that point to things like the fall of Jerusalem, the growing prevalence of deception one way or another, war, natural disaster, persecution, betrayal, rebellion, all those things we get up in the morning looking forward to. They're all there. Verses 17 through 20, Jesus says that the distress that we or others will experience as the end approaches will be unlike anything that anyone's ever seen. If you think the world's a mess now, just wait. There's trouble coming. Ryan Habenot, I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly, but he's the one who wrote the book that a number of us in the men's group read earlier in the year. He writes that there are storm clouds gathering on the horizon of history. But he goes on to say as well that most people one way or another are pretty much oblivious to it, including people who are followers of Jesus Christ. Proverbs 22:3 says that a prudent person sees danger and takes refuge, but the simple just keep going on and suffer for it. When it comes to what lies ahead, in our anticipation and our preparation, our expectations have to be shaped by reality. We can't afford to be like ostriches. What do ostriches do? What do we often refer to ostriches as doing? Putting their head in the sand. Now, they actually put their head in the sand for a good reason, but that isn't what we usually think of. We think of putting a head in the sand as just kind of ignoring everything that's going on around us. We can't do that. We can't do that. Having said that, our looking into the future also has to be shaped by hope. It has to be grounded in hope, It has to be grounded in hope. One of the things I've observed over the years is people can endure a lot if they have something that they can look forward to encourage them. And even with all the dark things that Jesus talks about here in chapter 13, there are a lot of things to buck us up. For instance, and we'll look at these also more fully in the weeks ahead. In the larger teaching of chapter 13, Jesus points to things like guidance and empowerment by the Holy Spirit, protection, endurance. All of those things will be part of it. In verse 29, he points to his return in power and in glory. And in chapter 12, which is where we're actually going to go next week before we come back to chapter 13, in chapter 12, he addresses the resurrection. There are a lot for us to be wary of as we think about the future and the events leading up to Christ's return, whether it happens in our time or somebody else's lifetime. There are a lot of things to be wary of, but there are also a lot of things to be encouraged by. A third thing that we have to do is move us to action. It's move us to action. And part of that is our awareness and our preparation, which is what a lot of the discourse is about. And we'll deal with some of that along the way as well. It's not enough to just know what's going to come or what could come. We have to be ready for it. which means that we have to take action. Well, let me go back to verse 29 in the parable where Jesus alludes to his return. I want to shift our attention to that here. And again, we're just kind of introducing some things that we'll come back to along the way over the next couple of months. Verse 26, Jesus speaks of his coming with great power and glory. You're probably aware that in the early years of Christianity, even though Jesus had promised that he was going to return and there had been the expectation of his return, there were questions that emerged. And there were doubts that grew. And in fact, the question of timing is underlying much of what Jesus writes in says in chapter 13. And the questions were, when is he coming back? But then eventually as time went on and Jesus didn't return and some of those first disciples started to die, then the question was, well, is he coming back at all? Was it all a hoax? Was it all a lie? Well, to that question of is he coming back, both Paul and Peter give us a resounding yes. Jesus' return will be real. Or as Havana puts it, the return of Christ is a settled fact. William Barclay, the Scottish preacher, put it this way: one thing we can be sure of is that history is going somewhere, and there is a consummation coming. That we will see that consummation at the return of Jesus. Which means it's something that we should be anticipating. We should be expecting it, which also means that we wait for it. When I was in college, I had the opportunity to attend an event with President Reagan when he came to the Twin Cities one time. And if you've ever been in an event like that, or you know of others who have, you know that anybody who's going to be there is there well before the president ever enters the room. They take your tickets, or they check your ID, they run you through security, they basically get you locked into the space before they ever let the president in, which means you wait. And depending on how his schedule is going, you may wait for a long time, but you wait. You wait knowing that sooner or later he'll come into the room. He'll come into the arena. Verse 28, Jesus is talking about the fig tree, and he speaks about the softening of branches and the budding of leaves. Interesting thing about fig trees is that their timing of things is not the same as most trees. We think of trees losing their leaves in the fall. Fig trees actually tend to lose their leaves in the winter. So they're kind of the last ones. Similarly, in the spring when other trees are budding or flowering, the fig tree basically doesn't do anything. It's the last one, generally, to start showing signs of life in the spring. You wait for the fig. You just wait for it. But as Jesus says, when it does finally start to show its life again, you know that summer is very close. It's right at the door, as Jesus says. It's not there yet, but it's getting very, very close. Summer is something you anticipate, and there are certain signs pointing to it. But when you see those signs, you know that things are getting close. But you still wait. Jesus' return is going to be real. It's something that we need to anticipate, that we need to look forward to, but when it does happen, it is still going to be a surprise. It's still going to be a surprise. You know, those first century Christians, those early Christians lived as if the return of Christ was just right around the corner. Every generation since has lived as if the return of Christ is right around the corner. Now, Peter reminds us that God doesn't think of time or count time the way we do. You know, he isn't beholden to a calendar, he isn't beholden to a clock. What he's committed to is a purpose and a plan. And that plan will unfold in his good time. And any time that we try to put a date or a time or fix a point at which things are going to happen, we're doing precisely what Jesus told us not to do. God isn't worried about the calendar or the clock the way we are worried about it. Jesus is going to come. It's a settled fact. But he'll come when God is ready for him to come and not a moment sooner. Which means that our posture, our primary posture, has to be one of preparation, of readiness. As we go through chapter 13, we'll see that Jesus gives us kind of he gives us the basic picture. He gives us the overall scheme of things. But there are a lot of details he doesn't give us. A lot of details we want to know, we wonder about, we'd like to know, but to be quite honest, we really probably don't need to know. But he gives us the basic picture. And that's what we're going to be delving into between now and November. Truth is, we don't have any firmer idea of when that consummation that Barclay talked about. We have no firmer idea of exactly when that's going to happen than Peter or Paul did. It may not come for centuries or longer. Or it may come before we leave this building this morning. We just don't know. Which means that we have to be ready. We have to be prepared. Barclay put it this way. He said, we must so live that it does not matter when he comes. It gives us the great task of making every day fit for him to see, and any moment ready for us to meet him face to face. All life then becomes a preparation to meet the King. All life becomes a preparation to meet the King. And here's the question then. Are we ready? Are we ready to meet the King? Now, on the one hand, if we know Jesus, we are. Because we know that it will be indeed a great and glorious day. A day of rejoicing, a day that we have been anticipating. But even when we are followers of Jesus, you could still ask, are we ready? And I ask this for this reason. Are we ready in that we are living in a way that when he does come, when we do get right around the corner and we meet him face to face, we'll be living in a way that's not going to embarrass us or displease him? Are we living in a way, too, or that we're getting on with what he left us here to do, so that when he comes back, like the master in the parable, he will say, well done, good and faithful servant. And I ask the question, are we ready not to put fear in our hearts, not to hold something over us, but just to remind us that yes, Jesus' return is going to be real, and it's going to come at a moment that we aren't ready, and therefore, as Barclay says, all of life must be a preparation to meet him. In a moment or two, we're going to share the Lord's Supper. And as we do, I want us to think about that issue of preparation. You know, I said last week that God relentlessly pursues us. And when we get to Advent, we're going to look at some early passages in Scripture where that pursuit is begun. And we're going to be focusing on God's pursuit of us and how that leads us right up to Christmas. And it's a pursuit that began right after the fall. And it's a pursuit that continues to this day. And it's a pursuit that will culminate when Jesus comes back. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote this. He said, "The world dreams of progress, of power, and of the future. But disciples meditate on the end, the last judgment, and the coming of the kingdom." So as we prepare to come to the table today, as we prepare to share communion, I guess we don't come to the table, we do our little tear-off things in the pews these days, but as we prepare to share the Lord's Supper, as much as it points back to the events of Jesus' crucifixion, it also points ahead to Jesus' return. And so as we come, let's dream about the coming of the kingdom and what it means to be ready and prepared for the King.